Hey everyone, it's Horror Free For All. I'm finally ready to bring you my top 10 best Tales from the Crypt episodes. I recently watched all 93 episodes spanning across all 7 seasons from 1989 to 1996 back in the day. And for a majority of these, which were first time watches for me, I was blown away by how fun this show was. And that also stems into the 3 Tales from the Crypt Presents movies that I wanted to add on to the show as a bonus to deliberate and possibly be put into the discussion of a top 10. While none of the 3 movies in question made it, I think even those are something worth visiting. Now, the quality, like most anthology shows, is very ebb and flow. There's a lot of highs and a lot of lows to weed through Tales from the Crypt. But the show, you cannot take this one aspect away from it. It is iconic, through and through. Whether we're talking about John Kassir voicing the Crypt Keeper, and the Crypt Keeper being as fun and as iconic as that character can be at times, creates this magic and this mystique for this IP. And I'm actually flabbergasted that the show has not seen a reboot in the recent years, because everybody seems to want it in the horror anthology community. Because whenever I talk to people about what are their favorite horror anthology shows of all time, there's 2 common answers: Twilight Zone and Tales from the Crypt. And when you hear the reasons, I can totally see why. This was basically a lot of firsts for the horror anthology subgenre. It was an R-rated, essentially, show put on a cable network that was HBO. So they were allowed to do more adult, more sleazy, more pervasive, more controversial stories than something done back in the day on syndicated television that would have been akin to Tales from the Dark Side or Monsters, for example. So this show often swung for the fences in the camp, in the schlock, in the gore, and it succeeded and created this tongue-in-cheek environment where the fans were allowed to live vicariously through what they were witnessing, and it carried this fun aura pretty much throughout the entirety of it. And I have to commend the show for doing this, and to the producers for translating what made these stories popular and why they resonated in the first place. If you don't know the origins behind Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Crypt was actually just one of many EC comic brands back in the atomic age of horror. You had shock suspense stories, crime suspense stories, the Vault of Horror, the Haunt of Fear, the list goes on. And you had 3 iconic narrators. I think one was the Old Witch, one was the Vault Keeper, and one was the Crypt Keeper. And the Crypt Keeper was chosen to be the icon of the show, essentially, and a bunch of different stories from different EC comics were blended in and called Tales from the Crypt. But it was done in a way to kind of modernize it and bring it to modern day, much like how we saw movies like Casper, which was based on a comic in 1930s and 40s cartoon being brought to the modern day around the 90s as well. This was a big trend going on. But when this show came out, it was bringing stories to the forefront that inspired an entire generation of creators, which were the producers and writers of the show, which also included Stephen King and George Romero, who created Creepshow. It also inspired people like R.L. Stine, who created Goosebumps. I mean, the list goes on. These stories pretty much formulated and popularized what became popular in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even up through the 2000s to present day. So without these comics, horror would never have been the same, and maybe wouldn't have reached a certain generation of kids, and the specific kids that created the iconic horror that we know and love today. So, Tales from the Crypt is an important adult horror anthology show to experience nonetheless. If you have not experienced this show ever, I highly recommend that you go watch all 93 episodes, formulate your own opinions, even watch the movies if you want to, so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. Now, with that out the way, this show, going into it, I do have a relative standard what I look for an adult horror anthology, whether we're talking about Dark Side, Monsters, Crypt, but I also usually try to weigh the abilities of the show and what makes a Dark Side episode good, or what makes a Monsters episode good, or what makes a Crypt episode good. So weighing the show out, it took me about a season or two to develop really what I was looking for, but nonetheless, once I got into the groove of it, Crypt offered some amazing stories. So many, in fact, I can't possibly fit all my honorable mentions on this video, but I did narrow it down to my top 10 and 5 honorable mentions. And all of these episodes scored about an 8.5 out of 10 or 4.25 out of 5 or higher for me. So these are pushing or right on the cusp of greatness for this show, at least in my opinion. Now, I know a lot of fan favorite and iconic episodes will not be on my top 10. I do have episodes I feel are underrated. Please just know that this is my list. This does not reflect what other people think about the show, and that's totally fine. Before we go any further, please let me know down in the comment section what your top 10 Tales from the Crypt episodes are. Now, with that out the way, I do have some strong honorable mentions. I'm going to show 4 here in a montage, and then I'm going to talk about one in depth just because I think it's deserved and because I really have a top 11 here. So take a look at my strongest honorable mentions.
The new arrival, the ventriloquist's dummy. Well-cooked ham. You murderer.
With that out the way, let's go ahead and start off with my strongest honorable mention, or my number 11, I should say. This episode came from season 4 and is one of the best episodes from that season, if not my favorite, and it's Split Personality. Now, Split Personality was the 49th episode overall. It was based on a story segment from The Vault of Horror number 30, and this one stars Joe Pesci. And without Joe Pesci in the role of this, it probably would not have gotten nearly as high. But Joe Pesci, who's been in great movies like Casino, Goodfellas, the list goes on. The guy is a Hollywood legend, and he brings something to these sleazebag, slimeball, mafioso characters that they become charming, and they become almost lovable, even though they do horrible things. It's one of those phenomenon, especially when we look at the grand scheme of Hollywood, where some actors are able to take people that you hate to love and make you love to hate them at the same time. But yeah, this story is one of those tales that don't feel all that different from other ones. It's a male gold digger story. You have similar morals to other stories out there of wearing a facade, abusing people's emotions, manipulation, and doing wrong, and having that karma be a boomerang and come back to bite you, and you're going to get your asshole comeuppance. That's all the story really offers. But it's the performances and the execution that make it endlessly rewatchable. The concept is a schmoozer who has basically been a con man for a long time. He has this narration, fourth wall breaking narration going on in the story where he's telling people how he just wants to get out of this lifestyle. He wants one last big payday so he can stop doing the small time stuff. Well, he gets an opportunity one day when his car breaks down. He ends up at this mansion with 2 women who are identical twins, and they are loaded in billions of dollars of money. So he wants to schmooze them and marry them, but the stipulation is they want a guy with a twin. So he creates a fake twin to get through to them and schmooze them to marry him and his fake brother, which succeeds. But as the story goes along, there are certain things that the twins start picking up on, and they start to see through the bullshit of the man. And let's just say there's an over-the-top finale involving Joe Pesci's character in the goriest and fun way possible. So this one is not quite on my top 10 for some small things about it. You know, it does feel like some other episodes of the show, and I think that's what really holds it back. And I think that's a detriment to Tales from the Crypt as a whole. Often than not, we find ourselves experiencing a similar story, similar morals, similar messages, and you just got to pick your favorite one of the bunch most of the time with that. And that's what this episode falls down into. But aside from that, This one, you gotta experience. You just gotta take my word on it. Go watch it. It's my strongest honorable mention for a reason. Now, with that out the way, let's start off with the top 10. So my number 10 is one of the two most underrated episodes of the entire show for me. It was directed by Chris Walas, who is one of my favorite directors of all time. There's just something that he is able to do in horror that I haven't seen others do, and that is take a situation or a scene or an action sequence unfolding, and he inserts these shots kind of from like a POV perspective from time to time that makes you see the horror from the character's eyes, and this one does it super well. And the episode in question is Til Death. Now, Til Death was a season 2 episode. It was episode 10 overall, and it came from the Vault of Horror number 28. And this story is one of those voodoo themed stories that you see in Crypt from time to time. It is very melodramatic in that lover's quarrel type of way that you'll see in Crypt from time to time. But what makes this one special in my eyes is the execution, the prosthetic work, how eerie the story can be at times, and the horror of it all. It makes it stand out. So the concept of this one is this guy is with this woman who may or may not be into the occult, I should say. And he's been with her, but he's kind of using her as a layover so he can get to this other woman who is this eye of his affection, essentially. So he, in a chauvinistic way, asked this woman that he's been laying over with to help him get to this woman of his dreams, essentially. And the scorned woman decides to help him and give him a love potion. And when this happens, it does work. It comes to backfire on the man, and he has to do something to the woman because she's a little crazy. Let's just say the woman may or may not die, but when she dies, she doesn't stay dead. And throughout the story, the man has to progressively see his nightmare keep coming back to him, and it gets more and more grotesque as the minutes and as the story goes along. Well, by the end of it, there's a big recontextualization for the man to see that what he did to the woman he was laying over with was wrong, quite in a literal way, because she may or may not explain it to him, and he gets what's coming to him for eternity, essentially. So yeah, there's other similar stories that kind of play on this humor. And it's one of those stories that talks about women being the prize of a man, and men kind of using women just to have, their temporary needs met without looking at the big picture. Men are constantly looking at the visual side of things and not looking at the deeper emotional side of things. Those are tropes we see in media all the time. And this one, in the Crypt lens, tells it in a humorous way. I think what really sells me on it is the horror, though. If you remove the Chris Walas effect that he had on this story, it wouldn't be in my top 10. I'm being honest with y'all. But for what it was tense, it was humorous, it was dark, and it was delightful. And that's all you can really ask for with Tales from the Crypt. Now, my number 9, this honestly is my most underrated episode of the whole show. Bar none. Not a lot of people give this episode credit, partly because it's a season 5 episode, and season 5 is very half and half with people. But it's ironic that I say half, because the story is halfway horrible. Now, Halfway Horrible was episode 64 overall, and it came from the Vault of Horror number 26. And this story felt very whole compared to other stories in Crypt, which kind of starts you off in these scenarios with these characters, and they try to sometimes exposition dump information for you to observe. Sometimes they kind of hold information and just throw it out there near the end as a reveal without much depth to it. So this one breaks the mold in that there's plenty of action and there's plenty of flashback elements to piece together the story and make it feel full circle. And I think just for a storytelling element, it works fine. But it's the horror of this one and some shocking scenes that also really work. So this story actually starts off with these two gentlemen. One is played by Martin Kove. If you don't know who he is, he's in Cobra Kai. Awesome. They're looking at a body of a man. And this prompts this one guy to kind of recollect on the past a bit. And he's talking about this man like he had a past with him. And you learn this backstory about these four gentlemen who went to Brazil years ago on a expedition looking for this plant that's fabled to be out there that may or may not have miraculous healing properties. But when they get there, they realize that the plant also requires some sort of sacrifice to gain access to it. And the guy, as the story goes along, you realize that he made a sacrifice of one of his friends, essentially, to get this plant so he can bring it back to the States, so he can profit off of it and change the world and become filthy rich. But because he did that, there's something that happened in terms of the plant, because the plant has some ties to maybe a voodoo ritual to make it work. And this has been causing the guy to kind of split off, and he's developed two sides of him, essentially. And this plays into a whodunit murder side plot of the story where people are ending up dead, and people are dying in grisly fashion. And the guy learns and starts to observe that what's been going on has been associated with what he did in the past, and he's the one that's causing all this problem in the present, and he has to figure out how to stop it. And by the end, he tries to stop it, and let's just say it leaves him brutally disfigured forever. So yeah, this story comes to talk about the atrocities of your past, coming to pay a toll on your sins and the harm that you caused others. It's a tale as old as time, but it's done in that modern way, at least for the time. I thought there were some very chilling scenes throughout this episode, especially dealing with the dead body in the morgue and how that ties into the story, and seeing the man being haunted by the cadaver that's in the morgue as well, and seeing some brutal murders on screen. You don't really see this in Crypt all too much, but when it is there, it's usually fun. But yeah, there's a brutal, just regular old murder in this that was just hardcore, and I was taken aback by that. And the ending to it, I think, sends it off in a fun note. Now, there are some things you kind of have to look past. Dealing with there's a recontextualization element, essentially, by the end that doesn't make all too much sense given the rest of the story. But other than that, I think this one was fantastic. Greatly paced, great story, horrific when it is there, and I love the ending to it. It's awesome. So, yeah, halfway horrible. At number 8, we have an episode from season 2. This one, I think, is criminally overlooked. There are people who give it its roses from time to time, but this one is super chilling, and it's very well made. It's one of those episodes that don't feel like traditional horror. It feels like a thriller, but in the best ways possible. And the story is Mute Witness to Murder. Now, Mute Witness to Murder was episode 21 overall. It came from a segment from the Crypt of Terror number 18. And this one, while it does have one gaping plot hole in it that I just can't overlook, the concept really works, and it's absolutely chilling. So, it's about a woman who's with her husband or fiance, and they're having a romantic night, and it gets ruined because they've been having some problems in their relationship, let's just say. So she goes outside to vent a little bit, and while she's out there, she's drinking, she's looking over through her neighbor's window, and she sees her neighbor brutally get murdered by a man. And the man may or may not catch on that she was watching it the whole time, and she's frozen in shock to the point where she can no longer talk. She's become mute, and she's traumatized dearly. So when the police come to ask her what has happened. She basically can't communicate at all. She can't write anything for some reason, which is the biggest plot hole to the story. And you just got to go with it. But after that, the guy who saw that she was watching ends up being a doctor at the psychiatric ward. And he suggests that she gets taken there and he'll give her professional help. And throughout the story, he tries to convince her that what she saw didn't happen. But when she doesn't seem to be picking up on that, he basically starts telling her that he's going to do with what he wants with her, and she's going to have to deal with it. She ends up being put in an isolated, padded cell, and he has this plan to essentially kill her if she tries to tell anybody what happened. And that plays into the ending, where we finally see the woman come together, and she may or may not get some revenge on the guy for all the emotional trauma and the threats that he's caused on her life. And there's also that thought-provoking thing of, did the madhouse create another loony in the loony bin? So yeah, it has that going for it too. But I love this story for how just chilling it is and how realistic it kind of plays on. It's pretty mortifying to think about witnessing somebody get murdered in front of your eyes. And I can only imagine how that inflects on trauma itself. The story's kind of prodding around the idea of trauma. And with the ending, recontextualizing the character to maybe have been doing this slightly on purpose. There is some unknowns with that, but trauma is a spectrum, and the story's like coming to examine whether a person could be stuck in that trauma, or they can get out of the trauma by essentially tackling it on head on. And that's basically what the story is a metaphor for, is overcoming that obstacle of trauma, overcoming what's caused you harm, and building a better you from it. Now, if the character is better after what she essentially does in the story, that's up for interpretation, but I think it's powerful for that. And it definitely has its thrilling moments to it, and slightly frightening moments dealing with this doctor and what he plans to do with this woman. I can only imagine the horrors of being mute and not being able to communicate what this doctor is doing to patrons working at the hospital. It's absolutely mortifying, and it works for that splendidly well. It's just a well-made episode. It does what it needs to do, and everything that it sets out to be, it accomplishes nice. Like I said, you got to overlook a giant plot hole in it when there was opportunity for the character to communicate without the doctor's interference. But with that aside, great episode. At number 7, we have another episode that took me by surprise. I think this was another season 5 episode, and it starred Steve Buscemi and I think Bon Scott from The Who. Very awesome casting for the main characters, and the story honestly left me speechless in some regards. And the story is Forever Ambergris. Forever Ambergris was episode 55 overall. It's based on a segment from Tales from the Crypt number 44. And this one is a time period story. I think it takes place in the Vietnam War. And you follow Bon Scott's character, who is this downtrodden photographer who is looking for the next big gig. And he is basically known for taking wartime photography, and this is how he's making his living during the Vietnamese War. But there's this other guy who's gotten way more success than him, and him and this man have a past together. And the other guy in question is Steve Buscemi's character. He's basically the inverse of the route of Bon Scott's life that could have gone. He's successful. He has a girlfriend/wife. He has his own place. Bon Scott doesn't have any of that. So he decides to try to, get involved with that person again. And in doing so, meeting Steve Buscemi and his wife, he starts to try to schmooze the wife into liking him, and kind of jealous, and he wants the other guy out of the picture, let's just say. So when they go on an assignment together to Vietnam, he overhears a soldier tell him something about this nearby town, which may have a airborne pathogen that causes bodily harm to people. That's why the town hasn't been burned down or anything, and that's why there's mass casualties over there. But the rest of the people don't know that. So when they arrive there, he's actually told to go to this town, but he convinces Steve Buscemi's character to go there instead. And we watch what happens to Steve Buscemi's character, essentially. And it's absolutely disgusting. And now that his character's out the way, he tries to go back home and schmooze his wife into liking him. But he doesn't know that before Steve Buscemi's character died, he was able to give one last message to his wife, and his wife essentially takes care of the man for him and does right by her husband or boyfriend, and gets her husband some vindication, let's just say. So yeah, this story was very emotional. It was grander than most episodes, I will say. You have the message of envy and wanting what other people have. That is very prevalent in this story. You have the thought-provoking nature of it, where you can think about it like, how far are you willing to go to take from others, and what are you willing to do to get what you want in life? And you can look at Bon Scott's character. He thinks he might want Steve Buscemi's wife, but I think it's more of the idea of her, and that kind of plays in a more ironic way to the story, where, you know, he just wants the lifestyle more than this woman. I think the woman picks up on that, which definitely makes the ending work splendidly well, I think. The only thing I really don't like about this story at times is how slow it can be. It does get into that slice of life territory and does spend a lot more time in the first half building up characters than usual, but it does take a while to click on to that back half and into the schlock fun. But other than that, this was a fantastically made episode. Acting performances were well done. The body horror effects were great. Let's just say there's something involving an eyeball that is absolutely disgusting. Yeah, great stuff. That's why it's here. All right, at number 6, we have an iconic episode of the show. This is a definite fan favorite. This is one of the handful of stories played up for pure horror, and it works in that way. It's just a very well-told, creepy story. It has Morton Downey Jr. leading the episode, and usually when Morton Downey Jr. is in a adult horror anthology episode, it's going to be good. And the story in question is Television Terror. Now, Television Terror was a season 2 episode. It was episode 22 overall, and it's based on a segment from The Haunt of Fear, number 17. And this story, honestly, is the most chilling of the whole show. Up front and center, it's about this news reporter trying to exploit tragedy that ties into some lore around the area they live in, and he wants to make money off of that and go inside the home where this tragic thing happened, of a mass murder essentially, and try to play it up like a haunted house attraction to capitalize on, you know, the horror market essentially. Well, while he's in there, we see multiple perspectives of the story, which makes it more dynamic than usual. You get the perspective of the team that's working in nearby vans or at the station that he's trying to air this at. And they all hate the man's guts. They think that he's a pompous dick. They think that he's only in this for himself. He's not trying to help other people or get their careers farther. He essentially treats himself as the star of the show, and what he says goes. He doesn't care to hear their input. So they really grow despondent of him, and they don't really care what happens to him inside this house. And we quite literally see them just allowing what happens to this man and to some of the people that agree to help him in this home of sorts to happen. So Morton Downey Jr.'s character, he's in there. You know, there has this lost footage aspect to it, like found footage. idea where they're filming some stuff in this room, and he's trying to tell like some dialogue along with it about the history of the house, and this is the room that so and so was murdered in, blah blah blah. But as the story goes along, there's some weird noises, people randomly start disappearing, and let's just say some bodies start turning up. There's some weird morbid visions started to kind of plague the story, and you're like, okay, where are they going with this? And as the story goes along, maybe the spirits or the inhabitants of this home are not happy that Morton Downey Jr. is there, and it basically gets caught on camera, and they're witnessing this as it's happening, and they do nothing to stop it. And let's just say something terrible happens to Morton Downey Jr. in an over-the-top fashion. So yeah, this story is just very tense and well done. It has this haunted house atmosphere going for it. It has that found footage aesthetic, but it also has that lovable, you love to hate him but hate to love him main character. You don't want to see them have too terrible of a fate, but you also kind of want to see them die, and that's what makes it fun. I do think the gore in this episode is very over the top. There's some legitimately traumatizing sequences, especially involving the room scene. If you've never seen that scene, I don't want to spoil anything about it. Go into it blind. You'll love it. And yeah, this has some things going for it, like to peel back with. You have the people that, his co-workers, they can't stand the guy, so they do nothing to help. That kind of plays into the fact that if you do right by others and you create a sense of community, or if you are a leader of said community, you need to represent your people well. And if you don't represent them well, they'll do away with you quicker than you can think, essentially. And this is a tale as old as time. That's how rulers of civilizations got overthrown millennia ago. Once they stop resonating with the people, they just let whatever bad thing happen to them, essentially. And that's essentially this story. And it's very entertaining. It's very well done. My only gripe with it is that near the end, we start getting into that you got to put some disbelief at the door with the schlock stuff. It is kind of overly schlocky and a little too extra than it should have been. But other than that, fantastically made episode, well paced, and easily one of the handful that actually play on genuine horror in this show. So now at number 5, this episode is, I guess, give or take, maybe hot and cold with some people out there. I actually think that this is one of the best made. It stars Larry Drake as the villain of the story, and Larry Drake is absolutely iconic. It's directed by Robert Zemeckis. Robert Zemeckis is absolutely iconic. And in my opinion, it has one of the most iconic stories associated with Tales from the Crypt. Whenever people talk about just the comics or maybe the Amicus horror movies from back in the day, they always bring up this one. And I can see why. The story is And All Through the House. Now, And All Through the House was actually the second episode of the entire show, and it comes from a story in the Vault of Horror number 35. Now, this one is known as the Killer Santa Claus story, but it's kind of like if you took Silent Night, Deadly Night, and you took the urban legend of the babysitter getting phone calls from inside the house story and you blended them together. That's essentially what you get here. It's a very suspenseful one. It has that Christmas aesthetic to it, and it's very over the top, but in the best ways possible. It's about a woman who has a daughter, and she has this husband that she doesn't really like anymore. And she wants out of the relationship, and she hates his guts and wants him dead. So she kills the man on Christmas and has to hide the body so the daughter doesn't see it. But once this happens, by some fate of circumstances, a killer has escaped a mental institution dressed as Santa Claus. And he's been going on a killing spree, and the police are looking for him. And somehow that character ends up at the home of the woman. And after she killed her husband, who could have helped her in this situation, she now has to not only protect her daughter from this guy, but save herself and save her own life. And the whole story is very tense, and it's very thrilling. And the ending is absolutely iconic to seeing Larry Drake saying naughty or nice. with the daughter. Absolutely iconic. And the stinger ending supposedly was not in the comic, but William Gaines himself, the creator of the EC comic brand, he thought that the stinger ending was absolutely amazing before he passed away, of course. But yeah, this story is just classic horror, classic terror. It works very well. It's well made, well shot. The acting performances are fun. The characters, they're not quite the lovable assholes. So the characters are a mild detract. You don't really get a full sense of why this woman wants her husband dead. It's kind of forced in there. They could have easily played that up a little bit better. But that's really my only mild negative with this story as a whole. It's very well shot. And like I said, it's very captivating and easy to consume. You can see the irony of the story about her killing her husband and then regretting that decision once the killer comes because she needs the husband to help. And you kind of see that deliberation of her character as the story goes along about her doing what she did. And we do think that the husband could be the one tormenting her for a while before the killer Santa Claus comes up as well. So there is that element of, is the husband actually dead there, which I think does play into the suspense of the story. The layers to peel back to this one is, of course, if you look at the urban legend of the hook hand killer, it kind of has something like that going for it, where they're doing something nefarious in that legend, where the teenagers, they are off on Lover's Lane. They shouldn't be doing it, but they did it anyway. And they're in giving themselves into the indulgences of their emotions and feelings. But somebody's there to strip all that away because they didn't listen to the warnings of others. This feels very similar to that for the wife, except without the warnings of others. She just gave into the impulsions and her emotions and did what she wanted without thinking of what could come later on. And that is the cautionary element to the story. It's more served best as a cautionary tale or as a urban legend than something with substance. But very well, like I said, very well put together and one of my favorites for a reason. Now at number 4, this episode, now we're getting into my 4 favorites. This episode is very well done. This stars Tim Roth, and Tim Roth did a hell of a performance here. And he brought something to this role that I think most actors probably couldn't, especially for a story trying to do what it was trying to do. And this story is Easel Kill Ya. Now, Easel Kill Ya is episode 32 overall from the show. It is based on a story from The Vault of Horror number 31. And this concept was eerie, and it worked as like a suspense thriller. So this struggling artist is lacking some inspiration, let's just say. And he has these thoughts, like these repressed urges to want to strangle people and kill them. And it might be trying to tie itself to sociopathic tendencies. I'm not too sure. It's very vague with that. But as the story goes along, he is interacting with this woman that he's really into, but he has this compulsion to do these things, so he's very standoffish with her. But after he, commits his first kill, he starts to get this inspiration, and he paints this beautiful painting that supposedly is worth a lot of money to somebody rich out there who collects this morbid stuff. And the guy essentially offers the painter more money to keep producing art like this. So this is giving him some ammunition to kind of go with his urges and kill people so he can keep making art and keep making money. And after, one of his neighbors die and his landlord dies, he's noticing that his relationship with this woman is starting to get spicier and heat up. So he has to hide this double life from her. And in doing so, it causes him to get more nervous about it. So he tries to call it off. But before he can call off this arrangement he has with this rich man, his girlfriend finds out what happened. And she is furious and they have a disagreement, but something tragic happens to his girlfriend. So now he has to make it right because he feels responsible for what happened to her. And he essentially agrees to do one last painting so he can get some money to help pay for an operation for this woman to save her life. But in doing this last painting on a sudden whim, he didn't really know who he was killing. And let's just say that plays into the hands of maybe the person or people that could save the woman's life. And it's a very downer note. But that's where the story ends. And I love the story for it kind of putting you in the mind of a would-be killer. At first, he's putting more thought into who he's killing because he doesn't like his neighbor. He doesn't like his landlord. But when he has to impulsively kill somebody, he's already broken the seal. It's easy to kill now. He doesn't think of who he's killing. He's just doing it to get something quickly done. And it ends up being the person that could have saved all of his wrongdoing beforehand. And it adds that emotional gut punch in the story that just really sends it home for me. The way it's shot, pretty, I would say, standard for the show, but the contemplation of a killer here makes the story enthralling, and it's very thought-provoking in that suppressed thoughts and those intrusive thoughts that we as people are conditioned to set aside in society and never act on them. But this is one of those stories where we get to live vicariously through the character and experience the wild side of it with that. And yeah, I think it works splendidly well. I mean, it tells an emotionally riveting story. It feels whole, almost one of the most whole out of all the episodes of the show. And yeah, it's fantastic. Go check this one out if you haven't seen it before. Now, my number 3, I love this episode to pieces. I have seen people give this episode more praise these days, and it's very deserving. This is another season 2 episode, and I love this one. It's Three's a Crowd. Now, Three's a Crowd is episode 11 overall. It came from Shock Suspense Stories number 11. And this story is very simple, and it's basically a soap opera drama, but it does it better than any soap opera genre story that you've ever seen. So the concept is very easy to ingest. This man, he is very insecure. He has an alcohol issue. Doesn't really have much going for him in life. He's gotten the short end of the stick recently with like bad luck, falling into depression. But he does have a loyal wife, and his wife really does care about him and really loves him and wants to help him out and give him that push that he needs to get out of this funk. So she enlists, the help of a former friend that he has an estranged relationship with to invite them out to his estate so he can, give him a fun time and maybe offer him a job. And the guy is too proud to work for the man. Apparently, him and this former guy have this contention with each other because his friend supposedly had a thing for his wife. And once the man and his wife go to visit this man, he starts to notice this odd behavior between the two where the woman is like being touched by the guy, and he starts to have these thoughts that maybe she's planning on leaving him for this man because the man essentially has the lifestyle that he doesn't. He can't provide this for his wife. He can't do anything that this man could do for her. So throughout the whole story, he's thinking that she's obviously going to have an affair or has been having an affair with this man. And they go on this yacht, and he's observing this odd behavior again, and just it sinks him into his own mind, and we get to watch him kind of unravel in his insecurity and in the manicness of it all. And he starts to convince himself, after finding some lingerie inside of the room, that his wife is for sure cheating on him. So he decides to take matters into his own hands and get some revenge. And let's just say something happens to the former friend and to his wife. But at the end, it's another gut puncher where we realize the reality of the story. And everything that he was thinking was far from the truth. Let's just say. And it's a masterpiece in a lot of ways of telling a story about how insecurity can make you detached from reality and how insecurity can make you do things that you normally wouldn't do. It's very emotional. It's almost a little too real. And that's kind of why I love it. It's just in your face about it. It's raw. It's impactful. Everything that happens in the story, you feel for the guy. you get the sense that he is really defeated. He's honestly in total belief that his life is unraveling. He has really nothing going for him and nothing left to lose. And that's his mindset into the climax. And I don't know, just something about it just works. And what happens to the friend and the wife is really fucked up, but it serves to impact the message of the story. And it's a cautionary tale at the same time to not let insecurities get the best of you. Once you do that, you start to spiral, you start to get unhinged, and you're not in a good headspace. And you shouldn't do that to yourself. And it's also coming to talk about how your insecurities reflect onto the people around you. They can impact the people around you, whether you realize it or not. Yeah, it's just a masterfully told story. My only issue is it does have some slow parts in and around the story. It does get mildly repetitive in that mid portion. But other than that, it's absolutely fantastic and a must watch for me. But now my top two, beginning with my number two, we're now at the genuinely perfect stories in my opinion. And I think this one, for what it is absolutely fantastic. It's the finale of season 3. And the story is Yellow. Yellow is episode 38 overall. It comes from Shock Suspense Stories #1. And if you didn't know a thing about this story, it actually was also in Two-Fisted Tales, which was a one-time aired movie in the early 90s. It was a failed attempt at a spinoff from Tales from the Crypt. But for this being a Tales from the Crypt story, I think it feels out of place, but at the same time, it's so well made. It's the longest episode ever. It's also another Robert Zemeckis story, and it's just very poetic. I don't know how else to describe this one. It's about a general. He's had a long career in the military. He's very decorated. He loves the military. He wears his reputation on his back. And during World War I, him and his son are actually on the same battlefield essentially, and he is his son's commanding officer essentially. But his son, he's rose in the rank of the military. He went to West Point and all that, but he doesn't want to be in the military. Being in war is something that he is not about, and he's starting to kind of show his true colors. He's very yellow on the front lines. He doesn't do what he needs to do, and the father starts to prod around his son and say, "Why are you doing this?" And he goes, "Well, I only joined the military to appease you, Dad. You never cared about what I wanted, and you're just a crappy father, essentially, and all you ever care about is me reflecting on your legacy." And the dad's like, "You know what? Why don't you nut up, and maybe I can help you here." So they come up with this idea that if he does this one last job with his team, the son can get moved into the reserves and out of the front line, which the son really wants because he doesn't want to be there and he hates being on the battlefield, and it gives him, I guess, anxiety or something. So the dad finally does something to compromise with him. But on the job, the son fucks up again and gets a bunch of people killed. And one of the survivors, before he died, pretty much painted him that he was yellow. He got him killed. He didn't do what he needed to do. So the general took him to essentially a court in times of war at this church, and they sentenced him to death via firing squad. And it ties into that night while the guy's trying to cope that he's going to die. His dad comes to visit him. They have a heart-to-heart moment about regrets about raising him and giving him the life that he probably deserved. And he gives him the idea that he has an idea for the son to get out of this, and the son's on board. But once we get to the ending, we realize that that might not be the truth, and the dad might have still just cared about his own legacy. It's a very harsh story, but I think it's a play on reality of parenting and being a kid. Often than not, you have the two sides of the spectrum here about parenting styles these days, where if you're a harsh parent, you're deemed as a bad parent, or your kid should be taken away. Or if you're a lax parent, you don't discipline your kid enough, and you're a bad parent for not disciplining, right? And this brings that confluence with the son and the father's relationship that's very on blast in the story. The son has resentment towards his father for being disconnected with him growing up, for not being a real dad, not really caring about what he thought. And the dad, he says, well, I just wanted what was best for you, but I also wanted you to carry on my legacy. I wanted to feel proud of you. So there's two reasonable perspectives that come together. And when you get to that point of the heart to heart, especially after the son was sentenced to death, that's where it all came together for me. And that's where, I was like, okay, I get what the story's trying to do. But the twist, the harsh twist, makes this story perfect. Because it shows that people don't change. And look, the son was never going to change. The dad was never going to change. And I just think that it's poetic on both sides. It just works very well. And it's super memorable. And it won the show some awards. I think it won a Golden Globe or something, or an Emmy. It deserves that. It was a fantastically made story. And for it being the longest Crypt episode, it was an absolute banger. But not as bangerific as my number one, because my number one came from season 1. And when I watched it, I was like, there's no way. There's absolutely no way any other episode's ever going to top this. And it never happened. This is one of my favorite adult horror anthology episodes ever made. It's absolutely perfect. I would change nothing about it. It is well paced. It has the most whole feeling story ever. There's so much themes woven into the story. There's so many action events and things about the story that we get to see that are absolutely fun. And it has one of the best main characters and twists. This stars Joe Pantoliano playing Ulrich the Undying. And if you know me, my favorite episode of the whole show is Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone. Now, Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone is episode 3 overall in the show, the 3rd episode ever. It came from the Haunt of Fear number 21. And let me tell you, Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone has that ambiance. It's set in a carnival setting. It has the acting performances. Joe Pantoliano and all the supporting cast. I think it was Bob Wall or whatever his name is. He's fantastic. I mean, there's no bad performance here. The concept is a mashup of science fiction, carnival horror, and a little bit of suspense. It's absolutely awesome to witness essentially a fantasy story told in a horrific way. It's awesome. I would change nothing about this. The concept of this one is about this homeless man named Ulrich. He is found by a researcher who essentially pays him to do a transplant, to have this gland from a cat put into his brain. And this process is done, and once it shows that it was mildly successful, the doctor decides to test out to see what the experiment was going to be for, and shoots Ulrich. And when Ulrich comes back to life, he's like, hey, you fucking killed me. He's like, well, it worked. The cat gland I put in your brain gives you multiple lives. And we can exploit this together. We can put you into a carnival syndicate. We can have people pay to come see you die, essentially. And you get to, have a better life than you do now. And Ulrich sees the opportunity in that. And the rest of the story speaks for itself. We get to see Ulrich die multiple times. But the added catch to this story, which I think is absolutely brilliant, when the story starts off, we see Ulrich in the future. He's laying in a box, and it's one of those noir narrative styles where he's telling the audience via the fourth wall about what's going on. And he's narrating the events about the past and how this catches up to the present. We get to see the twists and turns of Ulrich's journey here, where he has to make a decision involving the doctor who basically created him. He has a love interest that takes away one of his lives because she's a gold digger. He goes through highs and lows, and then by the end, you realize that he's just trying to have a normal life, and he's doing this one last stunt so that he can get away from it all and get away from all the trauma that he's faced in the story. But there's an added twist that he did not think of before he did the stunt, And that goes all the way back to the beginning of his journey. And it's shocking, but very poetic. This story is talking about whoring yourself out to what you're good at. It's definitely a commentary on professionalism, and basically anybody that's in a job out there as a career, you are good at what you're good at and you get paid for it, but does it bring you happiness, right? It makes you think about that. Ulrich, he was a homeless guy. He's given a great power. He's given a great ability, but he's using it to make money. And he has all these multiple lives that he seems to be wasting away just to get a paycheck. And he's not really living life. And you see that struggle in the story. He has to cut out the middleman of the doctor because the doctor's taking away what's rightfully his. He has to, unfortunately, get killed by this gold digger to see that she is pretty much mooching his money. And it's a story about a man who had nothing. He was given something, and then he had nothing to show for it by the end. It's kind of like blowing all your cards or blowing all your chips on one bet. He could have lived his life, many lives differently than how he did, and he chose the wrong path. And it's just very harrowing for that. And it's just super fun and engaging. I don't know what else to say about it. It's just a well-made, well-told story. Ulrich is easily the best character of the entire show. The story is the most fleshed out. It's the most expansive. It feels like a genuine film. It's absolutely fantastic. There's something about it that you just can't get from other episodes in this one. And that's why it's my favorite. And in my opinion, the best Tales from the Crypt episode. With that out the way, that is my top 10 best Tales from the Crypt episodes. Let me know down in the comment section, like I said before, what are your top 10 best Tales from the Crypt episodes? Do you agree with the ones I picked? Do you not agree with them? What are your thoughts on the ones I picked? I'm down to discuss this show. I loved it, and I hope you all had a fun time listening to what I had to say. And I hope you all, if you haven't seen Tales from the Crypt, to go experience the show and formulate your own lists and have fun with it like I did. So, till next time, take care.